Okay, I think we can start. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the EGPP seminar series. I see some new names. For those who don't know me, my name is Daniele Caramani, and I'm going to chair our session today. And also for those who are attending for the first time, this EGPP seminar series combines various forms of seminars, and today it's classical EGPP research seminar. We have three presenters, Stefan Telle, Claudia Badulescu, and Daniel Fernandez, with a paper on EU member states' positions on differentiated integration. What do governments say they want? Stefan Telle is a research fellow at the EGPP Horizon 2020 project in DVU. He's also working on a volume on Brexit with Brigitte Laffan. Claudia Badulescu is also involved in the IndieView project, and she is also a PhD researcher at the EUI, and so is Daniel Fernandez as a PhD researcher at the EUI. Thank you all three for making the time, accepting our invitation, and sharing your research. As you can see, unfortunately, we're back fully online, given that Tuscany reverted to orange zone status, which makes it impossible for us to meet in person or even in a hybrid way, as it was the case 2 sessions ago. But I have no doubt that nonetheless, this will be an engaging and stimulating seminar. In terms of format, the speakers will be Stefan and Claudia. They will give an initial presentation of about 35 to 40 minutes, and then all co-authors will take questions and comments. For those attending online, please keep your microphones muted, but the video switched on if possible. And during Q&A, you can raise your hand if you have a comment or would like to ask a question. Or if you cannot raise your hand, I mean, it's easy to do, sometimes doesn't always work, but it's under reactions. At the bottom of the screen, you have reactions, it's a smiley, and then you can raise hand. Otherwise, just write in the chat, I would like to ask a question, and then I'll take turns between the two modes. Okay, thank you all again for being with us today, and especially to our speakers. So Stefan starts, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you very much for this opportunity to present our report, Differentiated Integration. What do the EU member states think in the EGPP seminar series, which is really a great honor to us. This report provides a comparative overview of what the 27 member states think about differentiated integration. It is based on 27 country reports, which were produced over the course of the last year or so in the Horizon 2020 project, integrating diversity in the European Union, or in DVU. This is the first time that we present this first draft of our report, which was written by Claudia Badulescu, Daniel Fernandez, and myself, Stefan Telle. And we are very, very interested in your feedback and criticisms. And yes, regarding today's outline, we will first say a few words on what motivated us to work on this report. Then we have some things to say on conceptualization and the theoretical frameworks we considered in our study. I will then say a few words on data and methods, after which Claudia will take over and present a selection of our findings. And finally, I will summarize and conclude our presentation, hopefully in around 35 to 40 minutes. So let's begin. First of all, with the question of what is differentiated integration, as perhaps not everyone is actively involved in research on the issue. And on the left side of this slide, you can find a quotation taken from a fact sheet by the European Parliament in 2016. They said that as the number of European member states has increased and the competences of the Union have widened, some member states have on occasion been exempted from joining their partners in new fields of integration. And this is variously known as differentiated integration, variable geometry, multi-speed, or a la carte Europe. Now, if you look at the right side of this slide, you can see an example of what differentiated integration in the monetary union looked like in 2016. You can see the Eurozone countries, which had adopted the common currency, in the center in red, and then towards the fringes of the figure, you can see those EU member states which had not adopted the euro, but were nevertheless to different degrees participating in the monetary union. And what this figure also shows us that since 2016, more differentiation has happened. On the one hand, we know that the United Kingdom has actually left the European Union in the meantime. And on the other hand, the Czech Republic and Croatia have signed the Treaty on Stability, Coordination and Governance. So this is very much something that is happening right now. And this is the main motivation for writing this report. There's growing political and academic interest in the issue of differentiated integration, but at the moment there's still a lack of research on what the member states think about differentiated integration. And this is the gap which we want to address with our report. And it is important, I think, to mention that this report is rather exploratory in the sense that it tries to cast a wide net around various different aspects of differentiated integration rather than focusing on one or two aspects in depth. So we go for a broad exploration rather than an in-depth analysis. And what we try to answer in terms of research questions are two. First of all, what positions do EU member states take on differentiated integration? And secondly, why do they take these positions? To answer the first question, we have to think about what can member states actually take positions on with regard to differentiated integration. And if you remember the quotation by the European Parliament at the beginning of the presentation, differentiated integration is often presented in terms of exemptions from EU rules or opt-outs from EU rules, and therefore often thought of as member states wanting less integration. However, differentiation can also happen when member states, when a smaller group of member states actually seeks more integration, and they can use the instrument of enhanced cooperation to do so, to integrate more while other member states don't. So first, this is a first thing that we want to clarify in our report, that we look at these different mechanisms through which differentiation happens separately, and we think member states can take different positions on both of them. Then as member states or as such mechanisms are being used, the effect would be policy differentiation, which is what a lot of the research has focused on. And policy differentiation, by that we mean that there's variation in the degree to which member states participate in EU policies. And this should especially pertain to core state powers such as defense policy, fiscal policy, or the rule of law, because here, on the one hand, there are strong functional pressures to realize efficiency gains through integration, but on the other hand, in core state powers, there are also sovereignty concerns. And therefore, this dynamic between functional pressures and sovereignty concerns makes core state powers policies where we are most likely to find differentiation. And then we think of the long-term effects of policy differentiation on the European Union, on the functioning, on the nature of the European Union as polity differentiation. So those are the long-term effects of policy differentiation. Here we distinguish two different models of polity differentiation. On the one hand, a multi-speed Europe model, where differentiation is only a temporary solution, mainly rooted in differences in the member states' capacities to participate in EU policies. But ultimately, all member states would arrive at a uniform level of integration. On the other hand, we distinguish the model of multi-end Europe, where differentiation is a permanent feature or long-term feature of the European Union, because mainly the differentiation originates in divergent or diverse preferences of the member states, which are thought of as being rather stable or more stable than capacity differences. So those are the different dimensions that member states can take positions on: mechanisms, policy differentiation, and polity differentiation. And our second question is, why would they take these positions or different positions? And here we look at two different frameworks that we found in the literature. On the one hand, the demand and supply framework, often used by research in which Frank Schimmelpfennig is involved, such as the IndiView project. And here the idea is that differences in demand for integration are basically rooted in characteristics of the member states. And these characteristics are identified as size, wealth, and identity, meaning that, for example, bigger member states would be thought of being less dependent, needing integration less than smaller member states. Wealthy member states would want higher regulatory standards, while poorer member states would be interested in lower regulatory standards. And in terms of identity, member states with a higher share of citizens identifying as exclusively national would value sovereignty more than others. So this framework mainly looks at member state characteristics for explaining different preferences with regard to integration. And a second alternative framework looks instead at the expected effect which differentiated integration may have on the European Union or on member states, and it does so by focusing specifically on two dimensions. On the one hand, does differentiation make the European Union more legitimate? For example, by allowing member states to adjust their level of involvement, such as Denmark, for example, in the 2015 referendum has opted to maintain its opt-out and on one of its opt-out, and that has seemingly led to higher acceptance and legitimacy of the European Union in Denmark. And besides legitimacy, the other question is, what impact does differentiation have on the efficiency of the European Union? Does it allow the European Union to react more efficiently to challenges, or on the other hand, may it perhaps lead to fragmentation within the European Union and increasing transaction costs and less efficiency? And what we have done, bringing these two things together, on the one hand, our conceptualization of differentiated integration, and on the other hand, the two frameworks explaining variation, is to formulate a rather long series of hypotheses. We have 4 hypotheses for polity differentiation, 3 for policy differentiation, 5 for mechanisms of differentiation, and 2 more general hypotheses. And this slide is not intended to be readable for you, but we just want to give you an overview. And in a minute, Claudia will present results on a selection of these of this long list of hypotheses. But first of all, you may say, wait a minute, these are way too many hypotheses to actually do justice to all of them in the type of report that you have produced. Wouldn't it have been better to focus on 1 or 2? And our response would be, you're probably right. To do justice to these hypotheses, we should have focused, but our ambition, as I have said at the beginning, is to really try to initiate debate on this issue of what member states think about differentiated integration, and hopefully maybe encourage future research. Now, before handing over to Claudia, a few words on data and methods. Our main data source were 27 country reports, which have been produced in the IndieView project, answering these same questions. And they were mainly based on document analysis, such as government programs, prime ministerial speeches, and parliamentary minutes, focused on the time period 2008 to 2020. So we had a very rich source of qualitative data, and to help ourselves in doing this comparison now, we opted to reduce the complexity of our qualitative data by asking the authors of the reports to fill in a survey with some questions on the main dimensions that we are interested in. And as such, we have a quantitative, we have quantitative data as well. The analysis in the paper proceeds in 3 steps. First, we provide an overview of the member states' positions based on our survey data. We do this by showing simple bar charts or scatter plots and showing the distribution of member states. And then we use our qualitative data from the country reports to do 2 types of comparison. First, we discuss the best and worst fitting countries, which we see in our analysis in the scatter plots, which best and worst fit our theoretical expectations. And as a third step, we discuss those countries where we would have expected to fit the most or the least to our expectations. And with this, I will hand over to Claudia, who will present some of our findings.
Thank you very much, Stefan. So as Stefan mentioned, we have grouped our 14 hypotheses under 4 categories: polity DI, policy DI, DI mechanisms, and general hypothesis. Regarding polity differentiation, our first hypothesis formulated 2 competing expectations about how member states position themselves on 2 different DI models, multi-end Europe and multi-speed Europe. Hypothesis 1 stated that the multi-speed model would be received more favorably because it has advantages of deepening integration, while also minimizing the long-term costs and risks associated with differentiation. Hypothesis 2 stated that multi-end Europe would be perceived more favorably by the member states because it allows to permanently accommodate preferences for non-integration. As we can see in these 2 figures, while 6 countries view the multi-end model positively, 12 countries view it negatively or very negatively. As for the multi-speed model of DI, only 3 governments have a positive view of it, while 12 countries view it negatively or very negatively. Therefore, our findings could not confirm either of our first 2 hypotheses, as the 2 models received very similar and slightly negative average assessments. As the EU member states view both models of polity differentiation slightly negatively on average, we conclude that differentiated integration is perceived as a second best option to uniform integration. However, as we can see in these 2 figures, while both models are assessed equally negatively on average, there are some country differences. So up next, we decided to investigate what are the main factors that influence states' positions on DI. Thank you. Following the work of Frank Schimmelpfennig and Thomas Vinson, we investigated how member states' size, wealth, and identity influence assessments of the 2 DI models, multi-speed and multi-end Europe. Here we exemplify the results for member states' positions on multi-speed Europe. We expected that member states with a lower national identity or greater size or greater wealth would view multi-speed DI more positively than more national or smaller or poorer member states. Starting with size, our findings indicate that smaller countries actually view multi-speed Europe more positively than larger member states, and this goes against our expectations. Among the big countries, we found that Germany views multi-speed Europe more positively than multi-end Europe because it offers a more inclusive vision of the EU. In Italy, the multi-speed Europe model is viewed negatively due to fears that Italy may be drifting into a more peripheral position due to decreasing state capacity in comparison to the other founding states. Among the smaller states, we can distinguish between two groups. First, there is a group of small countries that are against multi-speed DI because they perceive it as a way of discriminating among member states and as a way of losing international leverage. That is the case of Romania and Bulgaria, for example. Second, there is the group of small countries that are in favor of multi-speed DI because they perceive it as a way to pursue deeper integration. And that is the case of Croatia, Finland, Latvia, or Luxembourg. Next slide, please. Concerning wealth, some of our findings confirm that wealthier member states are more positive about the multi-speed model. 3 countries at the opposite extremes of the wealth spectrum fit particularly well. Luxembourg favors the multi-speed model of DI as an avenue for deeper integration, while Romania and Bulgaria view this model as a threat to equal participation in the EU or as a fertile ground for growing discrepancies among the EU member states. However, we also have a few countries that went against our expectations. On the one hand, we have wealthy member states that have negative views of multi-speed Europe, such as Sweden and Ireland, due to fears of losing influence in the EU. And on the other hand, we have poorer member states, such as Latvia and Croatia, that have positive views of multi-speed Europe because they perceive it as a trajectory towards becoming part of core Europe. Next slide, please. As for the identity factor, we expected that member states with a smaller share of citizens identifying as exclusively national would view the multi-speed Europe model more positively. While we did find that this was the case in Romania and Bulgaria, we also found that there are some countries that do not fit our expectations. For example, Finland and Latvia have high shares of citizens identifying as exclusively national, but also assess multi-speed Europe positively. That is probably because national identity here does not contradict European identity, but is directed towards the historical experience with Russia. In Spain, a country that has a low share of exclusively national citizens, multi-speed Europe is seen negatively because it is associated with a drift towards the European periphery. So overall, our results regarding the effect of size, wealth, and identity on the position of member states on DI models are mixed. The qualitative analysis indicates that member states' positions are not determined necessarily by their structural characteristics, such as size, wealth, or identity, but also by their differing visions about the inclusiveness of the EU and by the member states' desired positionality within the EU. Member states that worry about their influence in the EU appear to view multi-speed Europe more negatively, such as Spain, Italy, Bulgaria, Ireland, or Sweden. By contrast, states that currently perceive themselves as part of the core rather than of the periphery of Europe view multi-speed Europe more positively, such as Latvia or Croatia. Next slide, please. We now move from the polity level DI to the policy level DI. Specifically, we looked at 3 policies which pertain to different core state powers and for which differences in size, wealth, and identity are expected to matter. We thus tested the influence of size on states' positions regarding PESCO, the influence of wealth on states' positions regarding the fiscal compact, and the influence of identity on states' positions regarding the European Public Prosecutor's Office. Here we exemplify the findings for the expectation that size should matter for member states' positions on defense policy. We expected that smaller states are more positive towards cooperation in defense policy, as that can be a way to benefit from pooled European resources. We tested this hypothesis by focusing on PESCO, which all EU member states, except for Denmark and Malta, have joined in 2017. In short, our findings provide little evidence for the realist expectation that smaller states had more positive positions on PESCO than bigger states. More specifically, the small and mid-sized Central and Eastern European member states did not have more positive positions on PESCO than big Western European member states. However, they did have an interest in European defense cooperation and joined PESCO as a way to integrate deeper, to benefit from the security provided by pooled European resources, and to upgrade their own military capacity. A majority of the countries from the least likely group of small states that generally have a neutral stance in defense policy, that is Austria, Finland, Ireland, and Sweden, decided to join PESCO. That was arguably achieved not because of active demand for stronger European defense policy, but rather thanks to Germany's push for inclusivity, which watered down the more ambitious French vision of PESCO. Next slide, please. With hypothesis 8, we analyzed the position of member states on two DI mechanisms, that is enhanced cooperation and opt-outs. We expected that member states view enhanced cooperation more positively than opt-outs because of the expected positive consequences that enhanced cooperation can have on the nature and functioning of the EU, such as more integration, more effectiveness, or more legitimacy. Our findings confirmed this expectation. We found that the majority of the member states have a positive position on enhanced cooperation and a much less favorable assessment of opt-outs. The difference in the assessment between the two DI mechanisms points to the interpretation that member states view DI primarily as a means to advance integration and not as a means to obtain exceptions from the EU rules. Next slide, please. Thank you. With hypothesis 9, we turned to the question of why member states assess DI mechanisms more or less positively. Hypothesis 9 was concerned with the expected effect of enhanced cooperation and opt-outs on polity effectiveness and legitimacy. We found that expectations matter indeed. States that perceive positively the impact of opt-outs and enhanced cooperation also assess these DI mechanisms positively. We found that the expected impact on effectiveness and legitimacy matter for positions on DI regarding both the EU level and the member state level. Next slide, please. In a final step, we analyzed three more general expectations about change over time, party ideology, and the coherence of member states' positions on DI. Here we exemplify our findings for the hypothesis 14, through which we expected to find that party ideology is not central to member states' assessment of DI. To see whether party ideology has an impact on DI positions, we have investigated whether a change in a state's position on DI corresponded to a change in the composition of the government. According to our findings, out of a total of 24 member states analyzed for this hypothesis, in 19 cases, party ideology did not play a central role in member states' positions on DI. In the remaining 5 cases, that is Croatia, Czechia, Greece, Denmark, and Poland, party ideology has had rather minor influences over member states' positions on DI, and most often these influences have revolved around the place that the country should have in the context of the emergence of a multi-speed or a multi-end Europe. And now I will pass back the word to Stefan for summary and conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. I will now say a few words on summarizing our findings regarding our two initial questions. And I start with the question of what positions do member states take on differentiated integration. With regard to polity differentiation, we found that both models are actually assessed equally negatively, slightly negatively, suggesting that polity differentiated European Union is seen as the second best option to uniform integration. With regard to policy differentiation, as Claudia said, we looked at the at defense cooperation and the impact that size would have. And here we found that actually context matters. It is not necessarily the case that all small member states are interested in more integration, but we found a group of neutral member states which were rather reluctant but ultimately joined, and a group of Central and Eastern European member states with lower capacities and a higher threat perception from Eastern Europe, perhaps, who were more positive. Finally, on differentiation mechanisms, we found that enhanced cooperation is viewed more positively than opt-outs, And what we're doing in the paper, but have not shown in the presentation, is that this is the case increasingly over time. So assessments of enhanced cooperation were improving over time, while assessments of opt-outs remained stable or slightly got slightly more negative. And our second questions as to why we, I will start with party ideology, because here we probably have the least data and we can really say the least. According to what we have found, it seems that it is not that important for how member states think about differentiated integration, but future research probably would be necessary to confirm this. With regards to the structural factors of wealth, size, and identity, we found mixed results. Sometimes we confirmed hypotheses, sometimes we didn't. With regard to expected impact, we found positive associations throughout, both for models of differentiated integration and mechanisms, both for legitimacy and effectiveness, both at the European level and at the member state level. And while this in itself may not be a surprising finding, that an instrument which is expected to have a positive effect is also positively evaluated, we believe it may point to a more fundamental point, which is that in understanding differences in how member states think about differentiated integration, we should not just look at the characteristics, structural characteristics of the member states, but what also matters is how member states think about the nature and functioning of the European Union, as well as their own experience of integration within the European Union. And with regard to integration experience, we saw that it actually matters a lot for new member states, but also for declining old member states, both of which are worried that differentiation will relegate them to a kind of second-class membership outside the core. Then with regard to different visions of the European Union, we saw that there's, for example, the French vision of the European Union seems much more ambitious, much more going in the direction of a federal kind of polity, which then leads to more positive assessments of differentiated integration, because it is seen as a tool that can help to achieve deeper integration among a smaller group of member states. While in the German case, we saw a higher emphasis on inclusiveness and therefore a more negative assessment of differentiated integration overall. Then we also found that the shadow, what we call the shadow of polity differentiation, so the long-term effects of differentiation on the European Union are kind of a disincentive for member states to engage in policy differentiation. Basically, ultimately, member states favor uniform integration over differentiation. And finally, we believe that there may be strategic ambiguity as another factor, because what we often saw is that member states take a neutral stance on differentiated integration, keeping their options open to sometimes engage in differentiation when it is seen as serving the national interest, but at other times not. And to conclude, in terms of contribution, we believe that our research complements existing research, which has so far focused a lot on the outcomes of differentiation, so the existing degree of differentiation. And instead, we have looked at what member states actually want, what their expressed preferences actually are. Also, existing research has focused rather on opt-outs from common rules, while we have developed and deployed a broader conceptualization. And finally, our empirical analysis has assessed the importance of factors which have already been discussed in the literature, but also, and importantly, our qualitative data has pointed to additional factors which may be important and which I have just mentioned. In terms of limitations and future research, what we would definitely like to have is more fine-grained data, for example, allowing us to look at change more in detail from one government to another within a member state, but also to have more data on specific policies. Another point is that in light of our findings, we think our hypotheses need to be respecified. And here we believe that it might be particularly interesting to look at what actually determines how member states think about the impact of differentiation, because it seems that the structural factors, size, wealth, and identity may not be as important as perhaps other factors. And finally, as an avenue for future research, we think it might be interesting to explore whether there is a gap between what member states say they want in terms of differentiated integration and what outcomes we can observe in differentiated integration. With this, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions. We are looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Claudia, for the presentation. It was really very interesting and very clear in spite of the many hypotheses and data you presented. So the floor now is open for questions and comments. Bridget, yes, please.
So if you don't mind if I go first, because I have to leave for my executive meeting very quickly. So I want to thank all three of you for, and this is the first time I've heard this. I haven't actually read the report. So it was very interesting because I engaged with you a lot as the work was being done. And obviously, you've got to distill those hypotheses. There are too many of them. But I wonder whether one way of approaching it might be to think about the EU is a system of differentiated integration, à la Schimmelfenning. It's a structural feature of the polity. But that doesn't mean all member states actually adopt differentiation, because there are some member states that are involved in everything. So maybe one way to think about distinguishing as a first cut is between those member states that are that participate in all dimensions of integration versus those that don't. And then when it comes to that first group of those who are in the middle of all of those diagrams, then in terms of their preferences, is the preference on differentiated integration that it's second best, and that there's a preference for multi-speed rather than multi-end? And then when it comes to the second group of states, those that have varied participations in different elements of integration, then look at the attitude towards policy and polity. But those that are involved in everything, I think it's their preferences about differentiation that matter, and whether it's multi-speed or multi-end. And then I wonder whether an important variable is date of accession. In other words, how important is it? What difference does it make when a member state joined? And then the other question I have is whether or not one can see clusters or patterns across member states, either geographical or size or whatever. It seems not size, but there may be geographical patterns there that might be worth looking at. But that's a first reaction to what was quite a complex presentation. But thank you all.
Thank you, Bridget. Would you like to react?
Yes, thank you very much, Bridget, for your comments, and I think they will be very useful for us. I think, yes, definitely we should perhaps look into make the distinction between those countries that participate in all EU policies and those that have opted out of some of them. I think we can look into this for sure. On this, however, I would like to perhaps point to the difference between Germany and France, both of which participate in all EU policies and most or all instances of enhanced cooperation, but they think about differentiated integration rather differently, at least according to what we have found. While France has views differentiation as a positive tool to achieve deeper integration, Germany views it rather more negatively as a potential threat to the inclusiveness in the European Union. So we think, while I think that we should investigate this, we have some indications that it matters what member states want to achieve in terms of European integration, maybe in addition to what they have already achieved or where they are currently positioned. Date of accession, we have also thought about it, but we have not looked into it yet because we felt that our report is already, it grew longer and longer than we had expected, and we can definitely look into that as well. And with regard to country clusters, I think what we would have to look into is to specify more in terms of maybe policies, in terms of specific mechanisms, and in terms of specific models of differentiation, whether we see country clusters. But my first intuition would be that I think we didn't really find strong evidence for country clusters. I will leave it at that. Maybe Claudia or Daniel want to add something.
Yes. It's a very interesting point. I mean, the comparison France and Germany being one traditionally very centralized state and the other a federal one, maybe state traditions matter in the way in which you approach diversity and autonomy within a union. So I think these state traditions certainly matter a lot. Before going to the list, maybe Bridget, since you have to leave, did you want to rejoin?
So I think precisely the difference between France and Germany. So in other words, you distinguish between those that are involved in everything and those that are not. But then within that, look at the variation in terms of express preferences among the different groups. I just think those who are involved in everything, the cut, it's a useful first cut.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So on the list, I have Vittoria and Adrienne. So Vittoria, you're next.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Vittoria. I'm a researcher at the Institut für Europäische Politik in Berlin, and specifically in the EU-IDEA project, which is also part of the broader DICE network. And it was a great presentation. Thank you so much. I had a question and a comment. So I'm sorry if I might have missed it, but my question would go in the direction, what was your time span when you analyzed the documents for the reports? Because I think that might be interesting. And another comment is that actually we're right now within the EU-IDEA project working on a data set, actually 2 data sets. And the one I'm working on is a data set based on interviews with political representatives. And at least for Germany, I can say that there was this very interesting, very different result from yours, that at least the people we interviewed saw differentiation as a rather positive instrument to achieve more integration, but the condition is that it remains an open instrument. So differentiated integration should be open to other members. So I think it might be very, very interesting to stay in touch and maybe see how this goes further. But thank you a lot for the presentation.
If you would like to react.
Should I try? Yeah. Yes, thank you very much for your question and your comment. And I start with the question. The time period that we are covering, which we are covering, is 2008 to 2020. And within that time period, we have focused on a number of years in which we have seen in our country reports that the salience of differentiated integration, so how much it was debated in parliament or in prime ministerial speeches, was particularly high. So that was for us important because because differentiated integration is actually not debated that much, we have found out. So to get most of our limited resources, we focused on those years where it is debated most, which was around the Lisbon Treaty, around the fiscal compact, and the last years surrounding Brexit and the white paper on the future of Europe. And actually, this is probably one of the main shortcomings of our entire comparative study, is that we in our quantitative survey data, we lump all this time period together, and we have only one data point per one observation per country on a specific aspect. We try to address this shortcoming a little bit, but also we had included a question about change over time, as well as a question on whether or not governmental ideology matters in our survey, but we did not have the resources to track in much detail change over time, unfortunately. And your comment on the data that you're working on, for us, I think, yes, it would be amazing to exchange about that. And I would be really interested to establish contact and talk about it. Regarding your observation on Germany, what we had to select information that we show in this presentation, but what we found for Germany is that there's a difference between the two models, so multi-speed Europe and multi-end Europe. And Germany was more positive about the multi-speed model, where differentiation is temporary, but it was very negative about the multi-end model. One of only 3 countries that had a very negative assessment of multi-end Europe. And perhaps that that might fit with your observation that Germany is rather positive, I think mainly with regard to enhanced cooperation, as long as it doesn't lead to the exclusion of member states in the long run. I will leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Adrienne is next.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting research, and I think very well designed and conceptualized and highly interesting results. I just wanted to ask a few follow-up questions. You said that you want to look at other policy areas as well. So which one are you looking at? Will you be looking at? And my second question is, when you look at different forms of differentiated integration, of course, there are many more than the ones you focused on. Why did you select these 2? And what could it mean for your overall arguments if you had included more? Like, for instance, going for like the EMS outside the treaty as a form of joint action of the member states within the European Stability Mechanism. And but it would maybe change the overall results if you would have included more types of differentiated integration. And another point I wanted to ask, it was quickly raised before, that over change of times of forms of differentiated integration, which were supposed to be transitional, but were they then transitional? So is that something you will look at as well in your research, how these patterns develop over time, and what the impact is for the overall structure of the European Union as the architecture, the institutional architecture of the European Union being more kind of indeed differentiated and not being harmonized, not being kind of along a kind of a clearly developed design, systematic design, as you would probably go for in a treaty revision, in an overall treaty revision. So what is the impact on the overall structure of the European polity as such, in terms of institutional, if you want to say institutional regime of the polity as such? Thank you.
Who would like to respond?
And if you don't mind, I can respond to this one.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much for your comments. I mean, this is obviously very interesting in understanding, I mean, more dimensions of differentiated integration. The question that we have, given our limited resources, is to where do we stop? And I think here we kind of made a, this contribution of not only looking at opt-outs, but also looking at enhanced cooperation, also in terms of policy, different policies. We covered, I mean, given this time period, this more recent time period, the things that we could cover within the reports, the policies that we had were the ones that were observed during this time period. Now, in terms of change over time, this is something that we discussed already. And also, again, this is also a limitation in terms of what we can do with the reports. So, of course, the reports and the analysis that we're making in terms of the qualitative assessment of them are going to bring much richer explanations of what we're trying to do here, also included in the reports. In terms of comparing things across country with just a number in a quantitative way, that's much harder to do, and that's why we decided, at least for now, to have this change over time as a as a note there, because of the difficulties in comparing these things across country, across time, in the way that we can really ensure that's really comparable. So this is why we considered that and said, okay, we're going to have, we're going to put the focus on different dimensions, which I think is a valuable contribution right now. But then we can really look at the reports, and when we're writing these reports, to delve into them and to say, okay, this is what actually happened. I think this plays it safe instead of creating an index, because these contributions come from different experts from different countries, but we need to coordinate them somehow in order to have really comparable numbers coming from them. And to the point that's realistically, whether that can be done realistically, we don't know. That's why we wanted to focus more on these qualitative assessments.
Maybe I can add a short note on that, and maybe Stefan would like to complement the whole answer. With regards to the question on policies chosen, that the 27 country reports actually focused on a large number of policies relating to DI in Europe. So we had a look at inter-se agreements. We had a look, for example, at the Prüm Convention, the European Stability Mechanism, the Unified Patent Court. Then we also looked at external agreements, such as customs union with Turkey, or the Eastern Partnership. Then in terms of enhanced cooperation, we also had a look at the unitary patent or matrimonial property regimes. And in terms of opt-out policy fields, we also looked at, for example, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, or Schengen, or security and defense policy. So we had a look, like an overarching look in each of the 27 country reports. But then when putting them all together, it was really hard to find comparable data for a large number of policies. So then basing ourselves on the theory as well, we decided to choose for each of the big theories. So on security, for size, we chose security. For economy, we chose the fiscal compact, and then for rule of law, so for identity, we chose the European Public Prosecutor, because also these were actually some of the policies that we analyzed in the reports that really had comparable data across the 27 member states. So yeah, that was also another limitation, that, for example, in one of the reports you'd find data only for 3 out of 10 policies, and then it would change from a report to report. So that was an important limitation for our study as well.
Okay, thank you. Adrienne, does that answer your questions, or should Stefan add something?
And perhaps
I can't hear.
Can you hear? Can you hear me?
Yes.
yes.
Yes, it did actually. I just have to say that I had some technical problems, and sometimes I just didn't have any sound. So I only got about 60% of what was said. Well, that's my problem now here, technical problem.
Stefan, maybe very briefly.
Yes, very briefly. Just I can confirm what Claudia has just explained. We did include a large variety of policies in our analysis in the country reports. However, the policy level was not necessarily at the very core of our analysis, and because of our limited resources, we could not ask of our experts to do very structured analysis of this large array of policies. So the focus in the reports is rather on different models of differentiation and different mechanisms of differentiation. And then the policy level is was a little bit neglected, in fact. The second thing on what we call mechanisms of differentiation, we have looked at enhanced cooperation and opt-outs. In the paper, we mentioned that there are, of course, other such mechanisms, such as inter se agreements or other mechanisms. We did not focus on them, again, because we just didn't have the resources, but that would be something perhaps to include in a future paper.
Okay, thank you very much. Bruno next.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the presentation. I look forward to read your paper. I have a small comment on the case study about PESCO, because I think it's a tricky one, PESCO, in the sense that when you look at how the Treaty of Lisbon defined permanent structured cooperation, it seemed like a very demanding kind of cooperation. And for example, it would mean that neutral states, for example, would probably not be part of it. That's how it looked like it. Now, the way it's been established is very different. It was established basically as a kind of framework or a container, a sort of empty shell. And it's within PESCO that then specific projects of cooperation in defense are being launched. So there's lots of different projects, and the participation in the project differs. In some of the projects you have like 5 or 6 countries, in others you have 15 countries, not always the same. So what happened here is something maybe not expected by the drafters of the treaty, is that joining PESCO came at no cost. Okay, it's so the one thing that explains the willingness of almost all countries to join PESCO is sort of FOMO element. The fear of missing out. You want to be there in case something interesting happens for your country later on. You want to be part of it, and then you will see. Then you will see when the specific projects are being launched, whether your country is willing to participate or can participate. And that will depend on the specific projects. So what I want to say is that PESCO as such, so participating in PESCO doesn't mean much. It's cost-free. Everybody wants to be there. The actual choices on defense cooperation happen in a further stage or separately, because interestingly what happened is that France, being a bit unhappy with the fact that everybody wanted to join PESCO, has started a separate initiative outside the EU. I forgot how it's named. It's something like Strategic Defense Initiative or something. It's purely intergovernmental, and it has much fewer participants. So what you see here is that one of the countries most interested in defense cooperation, France, isn't too happy with the way PESCO developed because everybody's on board. And then they say, oh, but we want our own club, with the countries that really count in the field of defense. So that's what I wanted to say, is that when handling and when using PESCO as a case study, you have to be careful about the fact that it's a very superficial kind of cooperation, really. Thanks.
Who would like to respond?
I can just thank Bruno for the comment, because I must admit that we didn't take this in-depth detail about PESCO into consideration. We just looked at, so in the country reports, we looked for the keywords for PESCO, and then we saw that PESCO had the highest number, let's say, of findings, because there were so many states that joined this policy. So then that was also one of the reasons why we chose PESCO, but it's really an important detail to keep in mind. So thank you very much.
Perhaps I can add to that, that we, how can I say this? The difference between how PESCO was intended to in the Lisbon Treaty and then how it was actually implemented, we saw perhaps that was actually an active intervention by Germany with an interest of a more inclusive defense cooperation, and that was, as we understood it, important to bring the neutral states on board, and it also allowed the Central and Eastern European states to get something out of PESCO in terms of security and in terms of capacity building, but it made France, of course, unhappy in a sense, because it had to reduce its ambition. I think we have a few sentences on this in the report, but really, as Claudia said, not that much.
Okay, thank you. Hans-Peter is next.
Yeah, I have a simple question. I was very interested to hear that differentiated integration is considered as the second best solution. So the countries are relatively critical of this phenomenon. So my question is, why, if they are critical, does it happen increasingly? You showed first a graph where there is a very strong upward tendency, an upward trend for increasing differentiated integration. Why is it happening? And let me suggest a hypothesis, because I was also interested to see that those who like opting out most are Hungary and Poland. So those guys who, I mean, there are those guys who use this option of differentiated integration to get what they want. It's a deliberate strategy of some countries to sabotage certain things. What would you say to this?
Maybe I could quickly try to reply. I think what is important is that we look at what actually governmental actors we've mainly focused on say they want. So I think therefore we also have included in our explanation of why they take different positions, that there may be an element of strategic ambiguity where member states take maybe a neutral or negative position on models of differentiated integration. So in the long term, basically saying that they don't want the European Union to become more differentiated, but at the same time, at the policy level, they do engage in asking for exemptions for themselves. And this is, I think, one of the main reasons why we wanted to distinguish what countries do at the policy level, what they say they want, from what they say they want with regard to the European Union as a whole. And then maybe the second point on Hungary and Poland, maybe more broadly, that yes, I think maybe it is important to also look into countries, cases, again, to use our qualitative data to see what motivations specific countries may have. I think we're doing this to some extent in our report, which is quite long because we use so much of our qualitative data. But yes, I think this is something we should also look into, this strategic use of differentiation and how member states talk about differentiation.
Okay. Adrienne, did you raise your hand again?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. Going back to what both of you said now, Stefan, Telle and Hans-Peter, I think it's really crucial to really think, if that's done from the individual member states, particularly for strategic reasons regarding particular policy issues, and linking that to your differentiation in the project between polity differentiation and policy differentiation, it would be extremely interesting to know, so what exactly does this polity differentiation amount to in terms of the overall polity of the European Union? Does it mean that you have a kind of a rack-back institutional setup, which is made with all kinds of hybrid solutions and special solutions? And then, of course, the question would be, what does it mean for the overall, the most important pillars of the European Union and their main decision-making channels, that is, intergovernmental conferences of treaty change, indeed, Council of Ministers decisions, European Parliament in changing the treaty, but also the community method. And bringing that into a relationship, linking it to the question which I raised earlier, what does it mean that you have this more and more Europe à la carte? What does it mean for the overall polity? And I just want to refer to a very interesting book, manuscript by Stefano Bartolini on institutions and political institutions, where he kind of develops an analytical tools for institutions, which are helpful in analyzing whether, if once you have said, what does polity differentiation mean, which can help you tell whether indeed this polity differentiation leads to undermining of what the European Union in central pillars is right now, still is, let's put it that way, and where they become contrary to what actually the European Union wanted to be, and why this is so. So he actually develops these really interesting conceptual analytical tools, which can be used in order to pinpoint thresholds where that could happen, that in a way there would be not a falling apart, but becoming kind of a hodgepodge of institutional elements. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that new publication. Oh, it's not published yet, but new book of Stefano Bartolini.
Okay, thank you, Adrienne. I don't see anyone else. I have some points myself, or a couple of questions, if I may. But I don't want to jump. If someone else would like to, even ask Peter, maybe. Or Lorenzo, you're clapping, or would you like to?
No, I actually wanted to ask a question. I just on the wrong reaction button. Sorry for that. And yeah, thank you so much, Stefan, Claudia, and Daniel, for the very interesting presentation. I actually have a very small and rather direct question on a specific point. When you one of your findings is that basically party ideology does not matter much in terms of government preferences towards DI. And I was wondering, how do you capture party ideology? I guess you use a general left-right scalar or something similar. But I was wondering if you could, maybe add some other, indicators, like what about if you look at governments in terms of, more Galtan party that are part of the government, or a more general pro-anti-EU, and that maybe you would get some very uncontroversial and direct results, meaning that, you know, if a government is more pro-EU, it may have a more positive position towards the eye, but I don't know. But this could, you know, in any case, add something to your analysis, or simply if, you know, the government is made more of, let's say, mainstream or more kind of populist parties. That was just my simple question. Thank you so much.
Claudia, or Daniel, or Stefan?
I'll wait for the others.
All right. I should specify from the beginning that the ideology, the party ideology, was not a key, let's say, a key target for the findings of our reports, of the country reports. So when we drafted the 27 country reports, we focused, as Stefan was saying earlier, on DI models, DI mechanisms, and policies of DI. And so then when we decided to do this comparative report, we added this question on how things changed depending on ideology, but it was more of a, let's say, a side or an additional question that was addressed to the country contributors, to the country experts of each report. And it was, let's say, addressed as a side issue throughout the report. So we did focus on government and opposition, but we didn't go into the specifics of Galtan, or like each contributor kind of focused on how they perceive the change in government, like government and opposition. So that was the main focus of the report, and then we took it as such in the comparative paper. But then also we assumed through the hypothesis that the parties that are in government generally in Europe are rather pro-European. So the mainstream parties would be rather pro-European. Yeah, that was, let's say, an assumption. And we tested that, and only in 5 cases out of 24 states that had findings on this specific issue, on this specific topic, had an ideology, let's say, had an influence due to ideology on the DI position. Stefan, maybe you want to complement that.
Just very briefly, I think the way we asked the question was when there was a change in government in the country and the composition of the government changed, has the position on differentiation changed after that? And what we usually got as an answer is that it didn't change, but it did change in some cases. And I think importantly, as Claudia said, the effect of party ideology is something that we don't have much information on. We would like to have much more. The information that we do have suggests that it's often not important, but at the same time, I can maybe add that when reading our reports, we see on specific issues, such as maybe the fiscal compact in specific countries, there are differences in how parties on the left and on the right argue about that. I'm thinking now about Ireland, which I wrote the report for. So we don't know much. What we know seems to suggest that it's not that important, but we may understate how important it is in our current report. And yeah, we'll have to look at that in the future.
Okay, thank you. Wojciech?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Stefan, Claudia, and Daniel, for this paper. Very interesting. I just wanted to ask the similar question that Lorenzo has already asked, so I'll skip this. But I will then pick up on Hans-Peter's point about Poland and Hungary sabotaging the European Union. Now, I can say a few words also because I was a co-author of the paper on Poland, on the report that the authors have used here. And I must tell you that, of course, as we all know, in such kind of synthetic research, you always have to simplify a bit. But there is the nature of academic research that, first of all, you have to remember that the period that the author has analyzed spans from, as you say, 2008. I think our report indeed starts in 2004. And in this time, Poland had two governments, completely different governments, one rather pro-European and another one not so much. And the overall narrative, the overall discussion did not change that much. Okay, so here we've got an example in Hungary. On the other hand, you've got one government which is now quite long in power, and it also is changing its opinion as well. So sometimes, you know, we have to think about the details. But one issue important about these positions is that Poland, in fact, had only one protocol, secured one opt-out, which clarified how the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union is perceived, is in fact applicable, how it would interact with the national law. And I wouldn't say, so I was a bit surprised to see the conclusion by the authors that Poland and Hungary, in fact, are the most pro-opt-out countries. So I would consider that I would advise to reconsider that conclusion. To me, it looks a bit suspicious. I mean, I haven't read the paper. I'm sorry, I didn't have time. I will do that. But on the first look, it looks a bit suspicious to me to argue that Poland and Hungary are one category above, all other countries with regard to their approach towards the opt-out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wojciech. Would you like to respond or take the advice to have a closer look?
Very shortly, we had lots of discussions on Poland and Hungary, and also with the authors of the reports. And in the end, we have decided to categorize both countries a little bit higher than the others, because both countries are also kind of making use of an informal opt-out in not wanting to adopt the euro, and that has, I think, become stronger over time in both countries. The ambition to join the common currency has receded into the background in both countries, and we found statements by governmental officials which have said that both countries are basically very comfortable with that kind of arrangement, and therefore we have and it is I think an important cleavage, being inside or outside the euro, and therefore, because we found strong statements that there's no strong political will of joining the eurozone, even though there's a treaty obligation in those two countries, we've categorized them as being more positive toward opt-outs. But yes, we definitely had lots of discussions about this, and maybe we'll need to have more discussions yet.
Okay, a lot of very interesting points. I was myself taking notes on, I also didn't read the paper, but I found this very interesting. And there would always be the possibility to do more, and it's usually an unfair question, but to suggest why didn't you do this and that, but it raises a lot of interesting thoughts, what you presented. I was thinking, I mean, one point I had in mind was you take governmental actors, obviously, and positions that countries take as a whole, but obviously countries are complex constructs. There are a lot of sectors and segments of the economy and groups that might have completely different preferences. And I was wondering how this could be integrated, which sector would push for which kind of integration or how much integration. And of course, you cannot do this, but maybe these government positions do reflect answers to specific sectors, to appease them, for example. Say, okay, we don't go for full integration, we go for to some extent to appease certain, or to to strike compromises between them, to aggregate different preferences. And a second point that Hans-Peter, I think it was more provocative than he intended or than he expressed. It's a collective action problem. I mean, what are you measuring? What do countries want for the whole of the EU or for themselves? Because, of course, you can enhanced cooperation is a constraint for others. And it's obviously good to constrain others if you can keep your liberty. So you might be in favor for homogeneous integration, but not for you. So I think there is a collective action issue that you could investigate maybe a bit more, and maybe, as Adrienne suggested, with the help of an institutional or rational choice institutionalist framework. And another point, and it's unfair to say this, but you have all these hypotheses, but when I briefly think about differential integration, all sorts of other hypotheses come to mind. I mean, I mentioned one earlier, the difference between federal states and states that have a tradition of being very, of standardizing their territories very strongly in a very centralized way, like all Napoleonic states, France, of course, but all countries that adopted that model of public administration. I mean, these are cultural elements that remain then, and maybe they permeate then also when you think about a new construct like the European Union. Bridget mentioned age when was accession, but also, yes, even more historical issues, colonial history, the role in the war, or macroeconomic elements, for example, export economies versus some other kind of economy. How recently was the transition to democracy, for example? I can imagine that played a role in countries like Portugal or Spain, this anchoring, or the weight of the welfare state, because ultimately the European Union is quite a liberal project, or was a liberal project, and so these variables that for me would, I think, explain maybe a lot. Obviously, it's all very difficult, all very macro, so it's difficult. But I was wondering, and the last question, very small. Sorry, this differentiated integration. What kind of variable is it? You present it as a nominal variable, but is it not an ordinal variable? Is it not capturing more or less integration as well? Is it a nominal or ordinal variable? So I think these were 4 points presented a bit in a confused way.
Maybe Daniel, do you want to?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Daniele, for your very interesting comments. What I want to say to this is these reports it's a small step contribution towards what you're trying to say here, because if you look at the existing literature, people use outcome measures. So what happened? Was there an opt-out? What we're trying to do here is going a little bit backwards. Of course, we cannot be sure that what the governments are saying is actually their positions, because they may also be integrating other preferences of pressure groups, this and that. But it's a small step back in the scale of how the preferences form to see, to create a new variable that tells us something that comes a little bit behind what we actually see in the real world, which is what happens when there's enhanced cooperation, or what happens when there's an output or something like that. The other comments about the, the other reasons, so let's call it like that, that can explain these positions on differentiating integration. Of course, these are very interesting reasons, and we're going to come back to these. We're going to have always the problem of limited data, because we just have, at least for now, one observation per data point. And as of right now, with all the reasons that you gave us, plus the reasons that we already have more reasons than the data points that we have. So this is a problem that's we need to check whether expanding things to, as we said, to look at governmental level data instead of country level data. But this is a point well taken, and of course we're gonna look into this, and because these are very interesting explanations as well, and may also offer, more interesting insights than the ones we already have. In terms of your last point, these variables are, I would call them categorical, in the sense that we map different positions in terms of, that goes from very negative to negative, neutral, positive, and very positive. That's the way that these positions are coded. They do not relate to more or less integration, but they relate to specific dimensions of differentiated integration. I don't know if you two, or Stefan or Claudia, if you want to add something to this, but.
Okay. No, that's useful. Thanks. Thanks.
Maybe one last quick point on the collective problem that both yourself, Daniela, and Hans-Peter raised on the issue of pragmatism. I think that's the word that should be used, as well as strategic ambiguity, that states, in theory, they say, oh yes, we want to be in a united Europe, we want to advance all together in the same step, if possible. If not, each state should join whenever they're ready. But then in practice, they actually perform differently than what they say. So this is why I think our paper brings a big contribution to the literature, by looking exactly at what they say before joining or not joining a specific instance of DI. And then also regarding the collective action problem, that's whether we measure what they want for the EU or for themselves. We actually test a specific hypothesis on whether states position themselves in a positive or negative manner towards DI, depending on whether they perceive a positive effect of DI on the EU polity or the member state level. So then there we found that actually they perceive DI in a positive manner if they also expect a positive impact at the EU level and or at the member state level. But then there are specific, let's say, justifications for each case study for each country that maybe go into more detail in the paper.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. So it's 2 o'clock now, and the seminar comes to an end. Thank you very much, Stefan, Claudia, and Daniel, for a very stimulating and engaging session on your research. It was a pleasure to have you. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you everyone for a lively discussion. I remind that we reconvene in 2 weeks' time, and the next time it will be a book presentation, not a classical research seminar, and we will have the presentation of a book by Jonathan Slepin on foundations of European politics. He will be with us. It's a book written together with Catherine de Vries, Sarah Hobolt, and Sven Oliver Proksch. It's not confirmed yet that all co-authors will be present, but we will certainly have a selection of the authors of this book. Again, I repeat the title, Foundations of European Politics, and it's very interesting for us because it brings together the domestic politics with EU politics. So hopefully many of you will be with us again for the next session, and hopefully we can at least partly be in a seminar room. Otherwise we'll have to do it on Zoom again, but as you see, it works fine. Thank you very much again. Have a good week and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for my comments.